If your partner's body has become harder to read, less responsive, less aroused, less enthusiastic than it once was, I want you to consider something before you blame age, hormones, or the natural passage of time. Because in the majority of cases I encounter in clinical practice, the shift in a partner's responsiveness is not random and it is not inevitable. It traces back to something specific, something the male partner is doing or not doing in a way that the female body simply cannot override, no matter how willing the mind is. The body tells the truth, and today I am going to help you understand what it has been saying. Let's begin. Welcome back to the channel. If you are joining us for the first time, my name is Dr. Julia Rhodes. Before we go any further, I want to take one moment to speak to you directly. If you are a man over 60 who is serious about understanding his partner more deeply and creating the kind of intimate connection that most couples only dream about in their later years, this channel was created specifically for you. Hit that subscribe button right now and turn on your notifications, because today's video is one piece of a much larger conversation, and every piece matters. Subscribe. Let's get into what you came here for. The one mistake, what it actually is. The single most common foreplay mistake men over 60 make is this: treating foreplay as a transaction rather than an experience. Let me explain exactly what I mean by that, because this distinction is everything. Transactional foreplay is foreplay that exists to achieve a specific outcome. Its purpose is to produce arousal efficiently enough that the next phase of intimacy, typically intercourse, can proceed. It has a destination in mind from the moment it begins. And because it has a destination, it is shaped by urgency, by the quiet, often unconscious pressure to move through the preliminary steps and arrive at the goal. This transactional approach to foreplay is extraordinarily common in men over 60, and it is not because these men are selfish or uncaring. It is because in the earlier years of their intimate lives, this approach largely worked. Their partners' bodies were physiologically more responsive, more easily and quickly aroused, and more forgiving of a foreplay approach that prioritized efficiency over depth. But her body has changed, and the approach that once produced a passable result now produces no result at all. Here is the clinical reality in plain terms. Research consistently shows that women, particularly postmenopausal women, require not just more time in foreplay, but a fundamentally different quality of foreplay than younger women do. The issue is not simply duration, it is the nature of the engagement. Whether it is genuinely exploratory and present, or whether it is performing a function on the way to somewhere else, women are extraordinarily sensitive to this distinction, not always consciously, but at the level of the nervous system, which is where arousal actually begins. The difference between a partner who is genuinely present with her, fascinated by her, attuned to her, in no hurry to be anywhere other than exactly where he is, and a partner who is executing a familiar sequence of steps before the main event, is felt immediately and profoundly. The transactional approach communicates, without a single word being spoken, that foreplay is preliminary, that she is a threshold to be crossed rather than an experience to be had. And the female nervous system, particularly after menopause, responds to that communication by remaining exactly where it is, closed, guarded, physiologically unavailable for the arousal that the transaction is attempting to produce. This is why her body has become harder to reach, not because desire is gone, but because the approach being used is physiologically and psychologically incompatible with the way her desire now needs to be met. Why this mistake happens, the psychology behind it. Before I go any further, I want to spend a moment here because I think it matters enormously. This mistake happens for reasons that are completely understandable, and naming those reasons is part of what allows men to genuinely shift, rather than simply feeling criticized and trying harder in the same direction. The first reason is habit. In a long-term relationship, the intimate dynamic becomes habituated over years and decades. What worked in the early years, or what worked well enough to become the default, tends to persist long after the conditions that made it work have changed. Habit is not laziness. It is the brain's efficiency mechanism. And breaking intimate habit requires not just intention, but a genuine understanding of why the habit is no longer serving the relationship. The second reason is performance orientation. Men, particularly men of a certain generation, were taught both explicitly and culturally that sexual performance was their primary intimate responsibility, that the goal was the outcome, that success was defined by arrival at the destination. This performance orientation is deeply embedded, and it shapes the approach to foreplay in ways most men are not consciously aware of. Foreplay, in this frame, is preparation for performance, not an experience in its own right. The third reason is misread feedback. In the earlier years of the relationship, her body was more responsive and more quickly aroused. The transactional approach produced a result: lubrication, arousal, engagement. And that result was read as confirmation that the approach was correct. The fact that the approach is now producing a different result has been misread as evidence that something is wrong with her desire, her attraction, her hormones, rather than as feedback that the approach itself needs to change. And the fourth reason, perhaps the most important, is simply the absence of information. Nobody told these men that foreplay needs to evolve. Nobody explained that the approach that worked at 35 would need to be fundamentally reimagined at 65. The silence around this specific evolution in long-term intimacy is extraordinary, and it costs real couples real intimacy every single day. Understanding why the mistake happens is not an excuse for it. It is the prerequisite for genuinely changing it. Because a man who understands the psychology behind his own approach can work with that psychology to reshape it. A man who simply feels judged will try harder in the same direction and wonder why nothing changes. What the mistake does to her body. Let me explain precisely what transactional foreplay does to a woman's body. Because when men understand the physiology of what they are creating, the motivation to change becomes not just intellectual, but visceral. Female arousal is a physiological process that requires specific conditions to unfold. It is not a switch that can be flipped efficiently on the way to somewhere else. It is a cascade, a progressive series of neurological and vascular events that build on each other over time, producing the physical readiness that makes intimate contact feel pleasurable rather than neutral or uncomfortable. That cascade begins in the nervous system, specifically in the parasympathetic nervous system, which is responsible for rest, relaxation, and reproductive readiness. For the parasympathetic nervous system to become active and sustain the arousal cascade, it needs to feel safe, unhurried, not watched for results, not performing against a timeline. Research confirms this clearly. The sense of being rushed, of being an obstacle between a partner and his goal, rather than the experience itself, activates the sympathetic nervous system instead. The stress response, the fight or flight system. And the sympathetic nervous system is physiologically antagonistic to arousal. It suppresses the very cascade that foreplay is attempting to produce. What this means in practical terms is both profound and immediately actionable. Transactional foreplay that communicates urgency, that is shaped by a destination, that treats her arousal as a means to an end, activates her stress response, which suppresses her arousal, which produces exactly the reduced responsiveness that most men are interpreting as lost desire. She is not failing to respond because she does not want to. She is failing to respond because the approach being used is physiologically incompatible with the response it is attempting to produce. What the mistake does to her mind. The physical consequences of transactional foreplay are significant, but the psychological consequences may be even more so, because they accumulate in ways that compound the physical challenges enormously over time. Let me describe what happens psychologically for a woman whose intimate experiences have been consistently shaped by transactional foreplay. The first thing that happens is a gradual erosion of her sense of being desired as a person rather than as a function. When foreplay consistently communicates that her arousal is a threshold to be crossed, rather than an experience her partner is genuinely invested in, she begins, at some level below conscious thought, to feel that what her partner wants is not her. It is intimacy, sex, physical release, and she happens to be the vehicle. That felt reduction in personhood, that sense of being a means rather than an end, is one of the most powerful libido suppressors in existence. Because desire for most women is inseparable from feeling genuinely wanted and genuinely seen. And transactional foreplay is specifically incapable of producing either of those feelings. The second psychological consequence is performance anxiety. This is one that surprises most men when I describe it, because performance anxiety is generally understood as a male experience. But women in long-term relationships where foreplay has become transactional often develop their own form of it. A monitoring of their own responses, an awareness of whether they are responding as expected, a background anxiety about whether they are taking too long, requiring too much, being too difficult to arouse. This self-monitoring is the death of arousal. Research on sexual response is unambiguous on this point. The moment a woman moves from experiencing an intimate moment to observing and evaluating herself within it, the arousal cascade is interrupted. The very act of wondering whether she is responding correctly prevents the response from emerging naturally. Transactional foreplay creates this self-monitoring by making her feel that her arousal is being watched and timed, that there is a correct pace and a correct threshold, and that she is being measured against both. The third consequence is emotional withdrawal from intimacy over time. When intimate experiences consistently produce these feelings of being used as a function, of being anxiously self-monitored, of physical discomfort from insufficient arousal, a woman begins to emotionally distance herself from intimate engagement as a form of self-protection. Not as a rejection of her partner, as a reasonable, self-protective response to a consistent pattern of experience that leaves her feeling unseen and uncomfortable. This is what looks from the outside like lost desire. What it actually is the reasonable, emotional, and physiological consequence of an approach that the female body and mind were never designed to thrive under. The Fix. Part 1. Redefining what foreplay actually is. Now let us talk about the fix, and I want to start not with techniques, but with a fundamental reframe, because changing what you do without changing how you think about what you are doing will always produce limited results. The fix begins with a completely new definition of what foreplay is. Foreplay is not preparation for sex. Foreplay is not the preliminary phase before the main event. Foreplay is not the steps you take to make her ready for what you actually want. Foreplay is the experience. It is the intimacy itself. In many cases, it is the most important and most intimate part of the entire encounter. Research published in the Journal of Sex Research found that both men and women ideally want approximately 20 minutes of foreplay before intercourse, and yet most couples report that actual foreplay lasts roughly half that time. The gap between what both partners actually want and what actually happens is not a gap created by either person's lack of desire. It is a gap created by a shared cultural script that treats foreplay as preliminary and defines arrival at intercourse as success. When you adopt the understanding that foreplay is the experience, that what happens in those extended, unhurried, fully present minutes of physical closeness and exploration is not preamble but substance, everything about your approach changes. The destination disappears. The urgency dissolves. The monitoring of her progress toward arousal is replaced by genuine presence with her as she is right now, not as she needs to become in order for the next thing to happen. And her nervous system, the parasympathetic system that needs safety and unhurried space to initiate the arousal cascade, finally receives the conditions it needs. Research also shows something that is worth sitting with. Women indicate that foreplay is the most important part of a sexual encounter, more important than intercourse itself. Men, in contrast, identify intercourse as the most important aspect. This fundamental difference in how each partner relates to foreplay is one of the most significant sources of intimate disconnection in long-term relationships, and it is almost never explicitly discussed. The man who understands that for his partner, foreplay is not the gateway to intimacy, but the intimacy itself, and who approaches it accordingly, is the man whose partner's body begins, gradually and then significantly, to respond differently. This reframe is the foundation. Now let us build the practice on top of it. The Fix Part 2, the practical new approach. Let me give you the practical elements of a foreplay approach that is built around what her body and mind actually need, particularly after 60. Element 1, begin before the bedroom. The most impactful shift most men over 60 can make in their approach to foreplay costs nothing, requires no new techniques, and begins hours before any physical contact. It begins with how you show up for her during the day. Research on female arousal consistently shows that for most women, and especially for postmenopausal women whose responsive desire requires the right conditions to activate, the preconditions for intimate responsiveness are built not in the bedroom, but in the texture of the hours before it. In whether she felt seen today, in whether she was touched warmly without agenda, in whether a small, genuine act of connection happened between you that reminded her she is desired as a person. This is not manipulation. It is the biology of female desire. Her nervous system does not arrive at a bedroom encounter as a blank slate. It arrives carrying the emotional and relational temperature of everything that preceded it. Warmth, attention, and genuine presence during the day are the actual beginning of foreplay for most women. The physical contact that follows is the continuation, not the start. Element 2, remove the destination entirely. When you begin physical foreplay, remove all sense of destination from your approach. This is a deliberate, conscious act that requires practice, particularly for men whose intimate habits have been shaped by decades of destination-oriented foreplay. What removing the destination looks like in practice is this. Begin with no intention of where the encounter will go. Begin with the sole intention of being present with her, of touching her with genuine curiosity about what she responds to, of kissing her with no agenda beyond the kiss itself. This is not passive. It is one of the most actively engaged and attentive things a man can do in an intimate context. It requires full presence, full attention, a complete surrender of the monitoring, goal-oriented part of the mind in favor of the part that is simply here, with her, now. Element 3. Slow down significantly and then slow down more. Whatever pace you currently consider slow, have it. Research on tactile stimulation and arousal is clear that slow, deliberate touch activates specific nerve fibers, the C-tactile afferents, that are directly connected to the brain's emotional processing centers and are the neurological basis of the warm, deepening arousal that women describe as genuine desire. These fibers require slow stimulation to activate. Fast or mechanical touch bypasses them almost entirely. Slow does not mean lifeless. Slow, in the context of genuine presence and attention, is one of the most powerfully arousing qualities a touch can have. It communicates at the level of the nervous system that you are in no hurry to be anywhere other than exactly where you are. Element 4. Expand the geography of your attention. Most men default to a limited set of destinations during foreplay, typically the most obvious erogenous zones. This narrowness of approach is both physiologically limiting and psychologically communicative of the transactional mindset. Her body is an entire landscape. The neck, the collarbone, the inner wrists, the small of her back, the inner thighs, the shoulders, the scalp. These areas, approached with slow, warm, genuinely curious attention, produce arousal responses that are often richer and more sustained than anything the obvious destinations produce when approached directly and immediately. Explore with genuine curiosity, without a map and without a schedule. Let her responses guide you rather than a predetermined route. Element 5. Use words intentionally. The voice is one of the most powerful foreplay tools available and one of the most chronically underused. Quiet, genuine, specific words spoken close to her ear during intimate contact. Her name, a real expression of desire, something specific and true about what you find beautiful in her in this exact moment. Activate the psychological dimensions of arousal in ways that touch alone cannot fully reach. Not performed lines, not generic compliments, specific, true, quietly delivered expressions of genuine desire and genuine seeing. These words, in the context of slow and present physical attention, create an intimacy that most couples have not experienced in years. The Fix Part 3, Making It a Daily Practice. The practical elements I just described are not a checklist to execute on special occasions. They are a new daily orientation toward intimacy, one that needs to be practiced consistently to produce the lasting shift in her body's responsiveness that you are looking for. Here is what that daily practice looks like. Daily Practice 1. Non-transactional physical touch every day. Touch her every day in ways that carry no agenda. A hand resting on her shoulder while she reads, a genuine, unhurried hug that lasts long enough to feel complete. A kiss on the back of her neck while she is doing something else, not as an initiation, but as a simple expression of warmth and desire. This kind of consistent, non-transactional physical affection does two things. First, it maintains the neurological association between your touch and safety and warmth, rather than between your touch and pressure and performance. Second, it keeps the baseline of physical connection between you alive in a way that makes full, intimate engagement feel like a continuation of something ongoing, rather than a departure from the usual emotional distance. Daily Practice 2. Genuine curiosity about her experience. Ask her, outside of intimate moments, in a warm and unhurried context, what feels good for her right now? What has changed? What she would love more of? What she enjoys that you have not been doing enough of? This conversation, had regularly and without pressure, accomplishes something that no technique or approach can substitute for. It tells her that her experience is your genuine interest, that you are not approaching intimacy with a fixed program, but with real, sustained curiosity about what this particular woman, at this particular stage of her life, actually needs and enjoys. Most women never receive this curiosity from their long-term partners. And when they do, when a man demonstrates through consistent, genuine inquiry that her pleasure is something he is actively interested in understanding, the psychological shift in her relationship to intimacy is remarkable. Daily practice 3. Release the outcome. Perhaps the most important and most difficult element of daily practice is this: release your attachment to specific encounters in intimate encounters. Not every intimate experience needs to end in intercourse. Not every initiation of foreplay needs to progress to a predetermined destination. Some of the most intimately rich experiences available to couples over 60 are encounters that are entirely composed of foreplay, of extended, unhurried, genuinely present physical closeness without any pressure toward a particular outcome. When you release the outcome, you release the urgency. When you release the urgency, her nervous system relaxes. When her nervous system relaxes, the arousal cascade becomes possible. And when the arousal cascade becomes possible, everything that seemed impossible before becomes available again. The men I work with who make this shift, who commit to foreplay as experience rather than foreplay as transaction, consistently report changes in their partner's responsiveness within weeks. Not because they found a magic technique, but because they finally gave her body the conditions it needed to do what it has always been capable of doing. If today's video gave you something real, a clear understanding of what has been happening and a practical roadmap for changing it, then please do one thing right now. Hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, and share this video with a man who needs to hear it. Leave me a comment below and tell me, did today's video change the way you think about foreplay? I'm Dr. Julia Rhodes. I'll see you in the next one.